Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Tetzayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Deborah Asham Weiss in honor of Robert Weiss's birthday, in celebration of the birthday of my husband and life partner. May all your wishes and dreams come true, and may we continue to thrive in Israel. Okay, a few short announcements. The bookmarks. We open registration again, so anybody who wants, you can find it on today's daf. There's a link to register, and you should be able to find it there, or yesterday's daf. The last few dafim we put it up. And if you haven't gotten bookmarks, if you ordered them and didn't get them, unfortunately the mail system is very, 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 very slow. So wait patiently, you'll get them. Or if you want to double check that you ordered them, you can ask us and we'll make sure that you ordered. If you haven't received them, otherwise don't order twice. But if you haven't ordered and you want to get bookmarks, they have musagim, terms, which by the way, you can now find all the terms besides that it's on the first. It's on all the dapim until now. You can find them on every daf post, also the PDF of them. Also, we have a glossary on the website, which has the terms also. So you can look in the glossary if you're looking for some terms. And it's not a comprehensive list. It just has a bunch of the key terms. There's a checklist, so recommended to get it. In general, I'll just say we finished the first chapter, and I just want to kind of look back at the first chapter. I know Zevachim is hard and it's new and it's a lot of material that you're not familiar with. And over time, you're going to see how much you learn from the beginning of Zevachim until the end of Zevachim, and all these terms that seem strange to you in the beginning, which just become part of your, your normal routine of understanding what all these sacrifices are. That's number one. And, it's kind of, I always say, like the beginning of a movie. As time goes on, you start to understand what's going on. You don't understand it all at the beginning. That's okay. And I highly recommend, if you don't generally listen to the Beyond the Daf content, I think here it's very, very useful because we don't have time. Dafim are long and there's a lot of content in them. We don't always have time to go in depth. I even read, it made me think about it yesterday. Somebody wrote, I listened to Din and Daf yesterday, and it just gave me perspective on everything we're learning, and it's so meaningful. And, I think it's really important, particularly in Zevachim, to be able to take the time to really listen to some of the extra content to give the perspective of the depth and the overlooking perspective that we don't always get to do in the Daf Yomi class. That's why we have all the extra content. So I know you don't always have time to listen to everything, but pick one or two at least, and on a topic that looks like, oh yeah, I really want to understand more. There was a lot of extra content about intent, which is a really key concept here, why intent plays such an important role. So I will give a pitch to, you really should spend a little time doing that. It will help. Okay. What we're doing today, this stuff is a little, I would say more simple. It's not exactly simple. We're going to get into very complicated, not so complicated, but va-chomer rulings today. But the daf is kind of straightforward. What we're trying to do here, as we started yesterday, is we have a mishnah with all these halakhot of all these cases of people that are disqualified. If they do the avoda is disqualified. So if they do it in this way, or they do it when they're in a certain status, or if they do it when this is their status because they're, let's say, a zar, a non-kohen, and they do avoda in the temple, their avoda is disqualified. So the structure of today is super simple. 3 proofs for a zar. We had 2 yesterday. We're going to finish the second one today. 3 proofs. How we know, different proofs, how we know a zar, a non-kohen who does work in the temple, his avoda, any work he did, any sacrifices are completely disqualified. Then we get to 4 proofs, same idea, but 4 for onen, which is the next category. Then Rava is going to make a limitation on the onen from a va-chomer, and the Rava bar Ahilai is going to come and say, if you're going to say that va-chomer, I can say these 3 va-chomers that are totally ridiculous, and basically there's no room for your va-chomer, and rejects this limitation of Rava onto the halacha of onen. That's our structure for today. So let's start from the beginning. We had a zar. Where do we know? We saw one pasuk, v'yinazru mikodesh bnei Yisrael, which is really in the context of a tameh. Someone who's tameh disqualifies the avoda. But then it mentioned bnei Yisrael, and the question was, why are they mentioned at all? And they say, it must come to teach this extra halakha. It's definitely not the simple reading. That bnei Yisrael, who come into the temple and work, will also desecrate the avoda. Then we had this va-chomer. We're going to learn it from a va-chomer from a Baal Mum. Okay, now I'm going to bring up the study guide. And we're going to, show my screen. Okay. And we're going to look through the study guide, and we're going to see how this va-chomer works. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to do a Baal Mum, then we're going to say maybe from a tameh, maybe from Baal Mum and tameh together, maybe from an onen with a Baal Mum together. And each time we're going to reject it because we're going to say, va-chomer works on the principle that there's some leniency about something, and yet it's forbidden, or disqualified in this case. So we're going to learn from there to something that's more strict, that also, obviously, because it's more strict, it's obviously going to also be desecrated. But then we're going to say, but wait, if you can find a chumrah in the thing we're trying to learn from, like the balmum or the tamei, they each have their own chumrah, then you're going to reject the va-chomer. In the end, we're going to be able to keep the va-chomer, but you'll see all the rejections along the way. So this is in the house of Rabbi Yishmael. They brought this braita, bottom of Tevav and Mebet, Adi va-chomer mi balmum. So ma balmum she'ochel im avad chilel, zar she'eno ochel, enu din she'im avad chilel. What's the cool about a balmum? A balmum, who's a kohen who's blemished, is allowed to eat sacrificial meat. But a zar is never allowed to eat sacrificial meat, right? Again, we're talking about the stuff that's only allowed to kohanim. So things are only allowed to kohanim, are not only allowed to kohanim who can do the work, but even a balmum who can't do the work can't eat the sacrificial meat, like kodesh kodshim specifically. Whereas a zar can't eat kodesh kodshim, high-level sanctity items. So, ein odin, all the more so then, a zar, his law is stricter. Therefore, if the balmum's avoda they do in the temple is disqualified, so is the zar. But the problem is there's a chumrah about a balmum that isn't about a zar, and that's going to reject the va-chomer. Ma la balmum shkenasabo karev kimakriv. A blemish is actually more severe. Why? Because it also applies to kohanim and it also applies to animals. Animals that are sacrificed can also be blemished. So blemish is a wider category because it's also the karev, the person doing the sacrifice. The karev that is like the makriv. The thing that's sacrificed is also like the person being sacrificed, meaning they could both be blemished. So that's a chumrah. So you can't learn a va-chomer. Okay, tamei yochiach, but if you add in tamei to the picture, then that could prove it. Because tamei doesn't have lo asaba karev kimakriv, it doesn't have that chumrah. So if you take tamei and balmum together, right, you could say, well, that doesn't have that chumrah, but tamei has another chumrah. Ma'ala tamei shekem et tamei. But a tamei person who works in the temple, who obviously their work is going to be disqualified, but they're mitamei other people. They, right, if a tamei person can touch someone or touch other things and make them impure. So there's a chomer by tuma because it kind of can be passed down. So, balmum yochiach, but they're going to say, you're worried about that being a chomer by tamei, but we can prove it for balmum. In other words, if you take balmum by itself and you take tamei by itself, even though they each have kulas, they also each have chumras, so you can't learn. But you could do the combination and then say, right, obviously, the issue of karev kemakriv or the issue of mitamei is not the issue that's causing their work to be disqualified because each one doesn't have the other. That's our classic b'chazar adin lo rizeh kirizeh v'lo rizeh kirizeh. That doesn't have that chumrah. That doesn't have that chumrah. Hatzada shaveh shebehem. What's the least common denominator? Shemuzharin. They're warned from the Torah they can't do this, and imavdu chililu. And if they do it, their work is disqualified. So afani avizal. So I'll include the zar. Shehu mushal v'imavad chilel, because he's warned, and if he does the avoda, in other words, warned meaning it says in the Torah the zar can't work in the temple, and if he does the avoda, then he'll be just like the balmum and the tamei who are also warned in the Torah. Now they're warned, and their work is disqualified. Our zar is only warned, but we'll learn from va-chomer that he's also disqualified his work. So before we move on with this and bring up the problem with this, which as you can see on the chart, there's a problem here. But before we do that, we have to fill in something, which is minalan de mushar. Where is the zar warned in the Torah that he can't work in the temple? There's no actual explicit pasuk. Now, if you want to go back to the first pasuk we started with in yesterday's daf, imi vayinazru, and you want to learn from that vayinazru b'nei Israel, even though we said didn't exactly say that explicitly. Well, if you're going to learn it from that pasuk, then you get to the complete proof that it's also disqualified. So once you're learning it from that proof, that pasuk, you don't need this va-chomer. So obviously, whoever says this va-chomer doesn't think that that's the warning pasuk, because that pasuk would imply 100% chilul. You wouldn't need a va-chomer. You wouldn't need to go any farther. Elami v'zar lo yikrav alechem. Okay, there's a psukim in Bamidbar Yudchet that talk about the kohanim, and it says there that the zar shouldn't get near you. So they explain, it doesn't, right, what does it mean the zar shouldn't get near the kohanim, right? Obviously, kohanim can associate with non-kohanim. But what it means is, shouldn't come likrav, like from akriv korban, shouldn't come near you to do the avoda. And that's where we get the negative prohibition. Once we have a negative prohibition, we can include it with here. They're muzharim, just like the Baal Mum and the Tameh, and just like their avodah is mechulelet, right? It's disqualified, also the zar. However, ika lemifrach, you can knock this out. But the Baal Mum and the Tameh are never allowed to work in the temple, not even when there's bamot, not even when there's random mizbachot in the middle of nowhere that you're allowed to do in certain time periods. Okay, there were certain periods where there was no central place and you were allowed to use bamot, but a Baal Mum and a Tameh couldn't work there. But a zar could actually do the avoda in a bama. So there you have a chomer by these two that doesn't exist there, which means their work could be disqualified. It doesn't teach you anything about a zar. So we're kind of back to square one. But not completely, because now they're going to say, okay, lo tema tameh yochiach, ela ema onen yochiach. So let's take the onen instead. Now, what's funny about this, in another minute, we're going to say, how do you know an onen? His avoda is disqualified. But in the end, we're going to prove it. So we can use onen here and assume onen's work is disqualified. Now, what's an onen? This is someone in between the time of death until the time of burial of one of their close relatives. So they're not allowed to work in the temple. Okay, we're going to see later where we get this from. But why don't we say an onen will prove it? Because he doesn't have the same chumrah as the Baal Mum, lo asaba karev kimakriv, right? He doesn't have that. And so if we learn that with Baal Mum, we can say, but mal onen sheken asur b'ma'asil. An onen can't eat ma'aser sheni. How do we know that? Well, there's something called vidui ma'asrot that you're supposed to do. At the end of the 4th and the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, you're supposed to get rid of all the ma'aser in your house. And then you say, lo bi'arti ba'oni mimenu. One of the things you say is, I didn't eat it when I was in onen. Okay? Not lo bi'arti, something ba'oni mimenu. I forgot now. It eludes me the pasuk. But lo achalti ba'oni mimenu, I think it says. I think it's lo achalti. I didn't eat it when I was in onen. Okay? Which makes it clear that an onen can't eat maaser sheni. So, the onen is asur b'maaser. So there you have a chumrah. Maybe because of that, if the onen does avoda, they're not really connected, but it's just saying there's a chumrah by onen that doesn't exist by any of these other people. Baal Mum can eat maaser sheni, a Tameh can eat maaser sheni. Okay, none of these things. So it has its own chumrah, and a zar obviously can eat maaser sheni. So Baal Mum yochiach, but they say, but if you take the onen and you put it on the scale with the Baal Mum, right, this one will knock out that one, neutralize it. V'chazar adin, lo rizeh kirizeh. Okay, and then go back to the whole tzad shaveh. They're warned from the Torah, and if they do it, it's disqualified. So therefore, we'll learn from there to the zar. But hachanami lifroch, we could still knock that out. Why? But they're also Baal Mum and onen are also not permitted in the bama. Now, how do we know an onen isn't permitted in the bama? We don't actually know. And in fact, that's going to be the issue, the knockout here. Okay, what they did right now is they knocked out the va-chomer by saying there's a chomer by Baal Mum and onen that doesn't exist by a zar, because a zar could work in the bamot, and a Baal Mum and onen can't. But now they're going to say, how do you know an onen can't work in the bama? Mat kavla Rav Sama b'rei Rava, u'mat leimalan de onen asur b'bama, dil mashari b'bama. We don't have any source that says an onen can't work on a bama. There's these outside external mizbachot. Maybe an onen can. And in fact, the reason to say all the more so, because the pasuk we're going to see for the onen, one of the possible psukim is Aaron is told u'min mikdash lo yetze, don't leave the mikdash when you're an onen. He's a kohen gadol. From there they assume only a kohen gadol, but a kohen idiot should leave the mikdash. Okay, regular kohen. So notice it says min mikdash lo yetze, right? Aaron can't leave the mikdash, which means the regular kohanim have to leave the mikdash, but only the mikdash, maybe not a bama that's out in the middle of nowhere. So from there we basically say that we can learn va-chomer from Baal Mum and onen together, because we don't necessarily have this chumrah that lo hutru b'bama. Maybe the onen is, and from there you can learn to a zar. Okay, and that's our va-chomer. So it took a long time to get there, but that's our second source how we know a zar who works in the temple will disqualify the avoda. Third source, another va-chomer, not as long-winded, but a little bit. Rav Misharshia Amal, Ata va-chomer mi Yoshev. From someone who sits in the temple when they're doing avoda. A kohen's not allowed to sit. If a kohen sits, it was one of the things listed in the Mishnah, the work would be disqualified. So ma yoshev she'ochel, now a yoshev can eat, meaning when you're a kohen and you're eating the kodesh kodeshim, you can eat them while you're sitting down. It's not a disqualification for eating. So, and yet, im avad, but if you did it during the avoda and you sat, chilel, you would disqualify the avoda. So, zal she'en ochel, now a zar can never eat sacrificial meat, right? That's forbidden. Eino, right, the kodesh kodeshim. He can eat shlamim, but we're talking about kodesh kodeshim that are only for the kohanim. Eino, so his din is more severe. Eino din shem avad chilel. So, obviously, if he does the avoda, it would be disqualified. That's our va-chomer. What's the problem? Mali yoshev shekem pasul le'edut. Well, sitting is a disqualification also somewhere else in the court. If you want to testify in court, you have to stand. So sitting is not only a disqualification in the temple, it's also a disqualification in the court. That makes it more severe. To which they say, well, maybe you could learn it from, okay, and that's a knockout to the va-chomer. But now they're going to say maybe not. Because yoshev tamid chacham. A tamid chacham is allowed to testify sitting. Okay, if you're a respectable person, you know you're a tamid chacham. Because of the respect accorded to Talmidei Chachamim, they're allowed to sit when they testify. So here you see, even though it's psulei do, but there is a tamid chacham, so it's not necessarily a chumrah. So they say no, it is still a chumrah because malashim yoshev shekem psulei do. But the in general you can't sit in the court. So yeah, there's an exception to the rule, but in general you can't sit. So they say, well, we have two answers. Either shem yoshev lo parich. No, you can't say yoshev is a chumrah when there are people who can sit in the court. So don't say all yoshev is pasulei dud or generally yoshev is pasulei dud, and that's a chumrah, because you see the Talmid Chacham doesn't, and therefore, we don't go by the general. We can use the specific example. If we use the specific example, then we get to the fact that yoshev isn't so severe, and we could learn a va-chomer to onen. Or imtim tzalom or parich, or if you do want to say, no, that really is a good knockout, because shem yoshev, meaning is still yoshev is pasulei dud. Let's go back to our previous list. Learn it from Yoshev and a Baal Mum, or Yoshev and an onen, right? Which they don't have the issue of pasulei dud. And a Baal Mum can testify, an onen can testify. Okay, we don't have all those pasulim or a tameh. So let's go back to one of the other ones, and together with Yoshev, we'll learn from one of the others. Now, Yoshev de kasher b'bama minalam. We'll remember what we got to at the end there. But maybe they're hutru b'bama. They're all not permitted in the bama. How do we know that Yoshev is permitted in the bama? Amar kra la'amod lifnei Hashem l'sharto lifnei Hashem v'lo lifnei bama. When it talks about standing in the temple, it says you have to stand before God. Now, when you're in a bama, you're not before God. God's presence is in the temple. Obviously, God's presence, we believe, is everywhere, but the idea is that God's presence is in a much more concentrated manner, and that's why you have to stand. But in a bama, there's not that issue, and therefore you can't say, oh, well, it's chamor because it's not allowed in the bama, and the zar is. No, we basically say we can learn from Yoshev and one of the others, and don't worry about the issue of bama because it's not true for Yoshev. So then it's in the same boat as onen, and we can learn. So in the end, we can learn either from two from the top list, or we can learn from Yoshev and one from the top list. Or maybe we can learn from Yoshev alone if we're not worried about this shame Yoshev, that the general Yoshev because of the Talmid Chacham, maybe that's another way. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing screen for a minute because the next section is not there. So now we go to onen. So what we have is 3 proofs for zar, 1 that vayinazru pasuk from yesterday, 2 va-chomers. Next, onen. Onen minala. Where do we get onen from? Dichtiv. Mina mikdash lo yitzeh v'lo yichalel. Ha'achir shelo yatsa chilel. So it says by Aaron, I said this before, the Kohen Gadol is told when, right, this was after Nadav and Avihu died, and he was basically an onen. So God says, don't leave the temple. V'lo yichalel, and you won't desecrate. In other words, now the way you could read this is, don't leave the temple because and don't worry, you won't desecrate. A regular Kohen should leave the temple, and if he doesn't, he will desecrate the avoda. But you're a Kohen Gadol, you're an exception. So that's how they read it, and from there you learn it. Second source. In this case, we're going to have 4, 2 from psukim and 2 from va-chomers. And by the way, it's going to be the same people who bring the psukim who bring the drashot from the va-chomers, and you're going to see the same type of va-chomers. So Rabbi Elazar Amar Mehacha. This is a very strange or complicated section. We're going to learn it really in depth when we get to Daf Kuf Aleph. There's a section after Nadav and Avihu died, where Aharon and his sons burnt. It was Rosh Chodesh. They burnt the sirizim instead of eating it. You bring a sirizim l'chatat. The kohanim generally eat the meat, and they burnt it. And Moshe comes and says, "Why'd you burn the chatat?" And Aaron answers this very unclear answer, and he says, "Hein hayom hikrivu et chatatam." They today sacrificed the chatat ve'et olatam and their olah lefnei Hashem. Vatikredu oti ka'ela, and you're going to call me like them. Achalti chatat hayom hayita b'nei Hashem. And if I would eat the chatat today, would it be good in the eyes of God? Okay. It's a very unclear passage. There's two ways to understand it. So this drasha understands it in one way right now, which is Rabbi Elazar says from here, Hein hikrivu, which is a rhetorical question. Hein hikrivu? You think they sacrificed it? Now, basically, what they're going to say is that the way this works is that Moshe, when he was asking the question, why did you burn the chatat? He was saying, did you burn it because your son sacrificed the sacrifice, and they were onen because their brother had died, and they weren't allowed to, and because of that, is that why you're burning it? And Aaron says, you think hein hikrivu? No. I sacrificed it. I'm the Kohen Gadol. I'm allowed to sacrifice when I'm an onen. Now, whatever. Okay, Aaron's saying that's not why we burned it. Okay, the reason why we burned it, okay, is because we're going to see this later in the Gemara, mishum aninut, which is in the end they burned it because they couldn't eat it when they were in onen, and therefore there was nothing to do with the meat but to burn it because it was already going to be disqualified by the time they would eat it. So that would be the explanation to why they burnt it according to this reading. So. Hein hikrivu, let's read it inside. Ani krafti. Now, what do you learn from here? Michlal di'i inu ikriv shapir istaruf. Right now, what's implied from this whole thing? If they had done it, they would have had to burn it because burning means because it's disqualified. They would have had to burn it. So, what's clear if you read it in this way, that Aaron's saying, "Oh, you think they did it? No, I sacrificed it. Right? You weren't here. You didn't see what went on inside. I didn't. Right? I did it because I'm the one who's allowed to work in onen, and they're not." But again, you see there, if they worked in onen, it would have made sense. If they had done the sacrifice when they were in onen, it would have made sense that they would have to burn it. Rabbi Elazar, my time alo amaru mina mikdash lo yitzei. Now, why didn't Rabbi Elazar use the first pasuk? Right, that was pretty clear. Mina mikdash lo yitzei v'lo yichalel. Well, amar lecha miktiv ha'acher shelo yitzei chilel. All it's talking about there is Aaron. Aaron has to stay in the mikdash, and he won't desecrate. Now, the way we understood it was, meaning stay in the mikdash, do the avoda anyway, and don't worry that you're an onen and you're going to desecrate it. No, it's not desecration. And from there you can imply, though, is someone else would desecrate it if they were a regular kohen who was an onen. But it certainly doesn't say that in the pasuk. It's really only talking about Aaron, and you could just say, don't leave the mikdash and you won't desecrate it. In other words, it's a desecration for you to walk out of the mikdash and not do the avoda. And then it really has nothing to do with the other kohanim at all. V'idach my time alo amar hein hikrivu. Now, why didn't the first opinion learn from hein hikrivu? And that's because kasaval mipnei tum'ah nisrafa. Okay, there's a totally different way to read this. And like I said, we'll learn this much more in depth in Daf Kuf Aleph. But the reason he burnt it was they couldn't eat it right away because they were onening, and they left it a little bit because they couldn't eat it that day because they were an onen. And they were waiting till the nighttime to eat it. But what happened in the meantime? Someone, Tameh, came in contact with it. It became impure because they didn't eat it right away. Not that it necessarily had to happen this way. It's just what happened. It became impure, and because of that, they burnt it. But then this hein hikrivu wasn't a rhetorical question. What, you think they did it? I did it. No. Hein hikrivu ayom. They sacrificed their sacrifice, but we couldn't eat it because we were in onen, and therefore we left it, and therefore it became Tameh. And that's why we burnt it. And then that's a totally different reading, and therefore this doesn't teach you anything about not sacrificing it when you're an onen, because that wasn't what the discussion was about. Okay, third source. Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana. In the house of Rabbi Yishmael, they taught, Ati va-chomer mibal mum. Okay, now we're going to go back, and I'll bring up the study guide again. We're going to go back to the same type of va-chomer, and notice, by the way, it's the same as the previous, which is Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, it's from the house of Rabbi Yishmael, they taught. So same thing as before was also Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. It's going to be the same type of va-chomer. Ati va-chomer mibal mum. So this is a good review. We're going to turn now to Amud Bet. Uma ba'amum she'ochel im avad chilel. Okay, again, the ba'amum can eat the kodshin And yet, if he does the avoda, it's disqualified. Onen she'eno ochel eno din she'im avad chilel. An onen who doesn't eat at all, right? Isn't it eno din that if avad he would be chilel, he would desecrate it? So no, malabal mum shkenasabo krivim kimakrivim. It's the same as karev kimakriv, right? Again, the animals are like the people. Animals can also become balei mum. Zar yochiach, but again, the zar. Now here we're in the onen, so we're going to take zar instead of onen. The zar will prove it because he doesn't have this, chumra of lo asaba karev kimakriv. Ma lezar shken en lo takana. But wait, a zar situation can never be rectified. In onen, it's a passing phase, right? You're going to be in that for a day, and then you're not going to be an onen anymore. But a zar can never work in the temple. So maybe a zar, because they can never work in the temple, their work is desecrated, but maybe not the onen. Baal mum yochiach, but a baal mum can prove it. B'chazar din lo rizeh ki rizeh v'lo rizeh ki rizeh. Again, we're going to do the combo of baal mum and zar. Hatzara shevesh bahen shekem musharim v'imavdu chililu. Right, so what's the least common denominator? They're warned from the Torah, which already we proved about the zar where he's warned. And we already learned, im avdu chililu, if they do the avoda, it will be desecrated. So now we're going to do the exact same thing as before, right? So from there, you can get to the onen, who is warned, and if he does the avoda, it's desecrated. Now, what do we have to say? Well, where is it warned in the Torah that an onen can't do the avoda? Exact same thing we said last time. If you're going to use that first pasuk that we had, min mikdash lo yitzeh, that's talking about Aaron, and learn from there the kohen hedyot, well, then you don't need a va-chomer, because there it says not only, we're looking for a place where it says it's forbidden, but not that it's desecrated, because if it said it was desecrated, then we wouldn't need to go through this whole va-chomer. So if you want to use min mikdash lo yitzeh, it says v'lo yichalel, and then, again, the inverse is, well, the kohen hedyot who does it will be mechulal. So then we wouldn't need this va-chomer at all, because that's what we're searching for. Ela mihene krivu v'kasavar mipnei aninut nisrafa. It must be the source is hene krivu, and it's because it was aninut nisrafa. That was the way we understood in the first place, which was what they sacrificed. Of course, they didn't sacrifice it. Their onenim wouldn't sacrifice it, and it never says there if they sacrificed it, it would be desecrated, disqualified. So that's our pasuk. Okay, so now we have, since an onen is warned, and a baal mum and a zar are warned, and baal mum and zar we know their work is desecrated, likewise the onen. But wait, they all have a chumrah. They're never permitted in any way, shape, or form. A baal mum can never do the avoda, a zar can never do the avoda. But what do you have about an onen? An onen is permitted for a kohen gadol to do the avoda. There are cases where an onen can do the avoda if it's the kohen gadol. So that's not good. They have a chumrah that's not by an onen. Well, tamei yochiach. Because remember, tamei is hutar, tuma hutra b'tzibur. You remember this whole thing? That if the majority of the people are impure, you can actually do the avoda. If the majority of the kohanim are impure, you can do the avoda, you can do korbanot tzibur, public offerings. So, tamei yochiach, because again, it's lenient, because hutar michalo, and yet, if you work tamei in the mikdash, your work will be disqualified. But again, back to where we saw before. Mala tamei shakem mitamei. A tamei, though, passes on tuma to others or to other things. So that makes it chamor. But hanach yochichu. But the others will prove it. And if we put together baal mum, zar, and tamei, we have a chazar adin, atzara shavesh ben shemuz harim. Again, all three are warned and all three their work is desecrated. From there we could get to onen. V'lifroch, but one more difficulty, which we will resolve, and then we'll end with this va-chomer. We'll end this part. But none of these are permitted by a kohen gadol in an individual offering. In other words, the kohen gadol is allowed to do individual offerings in the temple when he's an onen. So that gives onen a specific leniency that none of these have, and therefore maybe an onen's work is not disqualified. But they say, right, right now, what they're trying to say here is, if you add tuma to the picture, tuma might be permitted b'tzibur, but it's not permitted even for a kohen gadol in an individual offering, and the onen is. That's why they're specifically talking about a kohen gadol. It's not permitted at all in a korban yachid, but they're specifically saying even a Kohen Gadol can't do it when it's a Korban Yachid. So that shows the Tumah is Chamor. Even though it's, there are cases where Tumah is Hutar, but not in that particular case, in the particular case where the onen is permitted, which would be a Kohen Gadol, right? So, in other words, I just want to say why they're saying Kohen Gadol and Korban Yachid. Kohen Gadol is to say the Kohen Gadol can work in the Mikdash when he's Tameh and it won't be accepted, right? Because if it's not Korban Tzibor and all the Tzibor is impure, right? So in a Korban Yachid, in Tum'ah, the Kohen Gadol can't work. And in onen, a Kohen Gadol can always work, Korban Yachid or Korban Tzibor. So it's clearly more lenient. But Shem Tumah Mia Ishtarya. But what do they say? Like we said before with the Shem Yoshev, the idea of Tumah is Hutra B'Tzibor. If we take Tumah as a global concept, there are ways that it's permitted, just like the onen. There are ways where it's permitted. That makes them enough of the same that we could say this isn't a chumrah, that it's not more chamor. So with that, we end our va-chomer, and we can learn it from a balmum, zar, and tameh. Fourth source, and this is going to be completely identical to the previous, and also said by the same person, and as the previous section of the zar. Rav Misharshi Amar Ati va-chomer mi Yoshev. Ma Yoshev she'ochel im avad chilel, onen she'no ochel enudin she'im avad chilel. So again, Yoshev, you're sitting in the temple. Someone who sits can't do the avoda, and his work is disqualified, but yet he has a kula, because if he eats kodshim while he's sitting down, there's no problem. So what do you see? Just like that's lenient and yet strict about the disqualification. Also the same for a zar, the onen. An onen can't eat the sacrificial meat at all, and therefore his work should be disqualified. But Mali Yoshev came pasuleidu, but we know that you can't sit in the court, so there you have a specific chomer about Yoshev. Yoshev Tamich Chacham. You can learn it from Yoshev Tamich Chacham, who can't sit in the court, right? Who's allowed to sit in the court, sorry. So because of that, there's no chomer in a Yoshev Tamich Chacham, and therefore Yoshev could learn to onen. But Malashim Yoshev came pasuleidu. But you could say still the global Yoshev is pasuleidu, just like, right, here we're trying to say the global Yoshev can't sit in the right, a regular person can't sit in the court, which is to reject the va-chomer before we use Shem Tumah to accept the va-chomer, right? There's Tumah Hutra B'Tzibor as a general concept, even though there might be a unique case where it's not, which is the Korban Yachid. But anyway, here we're going to use it to reject the va-chomer, and then we to reject the va-chomer, and now they're going to say, no, either you say Shem Yoshev Lo Parich, either we don't do that, or Imtim Tzalomar Parich, or if you do want to say it, could knock it out, Atim Yoshev Umichad Mehanach. We can go back to Yoshev and one of the previous ones on the list, the Balmum, the Zar, or the Tameh. Okay, just to point out one thing here. Since the third source, for example, okay, the third source, this is what I wanted to, specifically the third source to talk about, is right from the Balmum, the Zar, and the Tameh. And it said in the house, right, from the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yishmael. And before we're going to learn Zar from Balmum, Tameh, and Onen, right? So in the end, it's kind of funny because Onen, how do we know it's forbidden? Well, from this va-chomer. And in that va-chomer, we assume that we know that Zar is disqualified, right? And then when we get to the disqualification of the Zar, we use Onen. So it's all kind of a little circular because, right, each one presumes that, right, the Zar proof presumes that you know that onen is disqualified. But then you have to ask about onen. And when we asked about onen, we said, oh, you can learn it from a Zar. So you understand it's all a little bit circular. Okay, but if we're going to talk about circular va-chomers and confusing va-chomers, we're going to get to the last section of our daf right now. So what we did so far is very simple in terms of organizing. 3 sources for Zar, 1 from a pasuk, 2 from va-chomers to prove that a Zar that works in the temple, his work is disqualified. Then we did the same thing with the onen, but we have 4 proofs, 2 from psukim and 2 from va-chomers. And the same people who brought those va-chomers, they brought parallel va-chomers in both of the cases, right? They both, either Rav Misharshi or both from Yoshev, and then, or maybe Yoshev and one of the others, and then the house of Rabbi Yishmael, where they had this long-winded va-chomer from a bunch of different cases. Now we get to this limitation of this law of the onen pasul. The disqualification of onen is going to be somewhat qualified here. Onen pasul. I'm a Rava. Lo shanu ela bekorban yachid. The work an onen does in a korban yachid, in an individual sacrifice, will be disqualified. Aval bekorban tzibor meratzeh. But if it's a public korban, then it will be accepted. If it's a korban tamid, let's say, and he was an onen, did the avoda, we're going to accept that. We're going to let it go. Why? It's very simply, we're going to make a va-chomer from tuma. Tuma hutra b'tzibur, right? Tuma is permitted in a communal offering if the majority of the people are impure, but there's this heter. So we're going to learn a va-chomer from tuma. Va-chomer mituma. Ma tum'a shelo hutra michala etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid. Now this is what we said before. Tuma is not permitted for a kohen gadol in a korban yachid, right? If it's an individual offering and the kohen gadol is impure, we're not going to accept that, right? We're only going to accept it in a public offering. Could be a kohen gadol, could be a kohen idiot. It doesn't matter if the majority of the kohenim or the majority of the people are impure. But not for an individual offering. And yet, hutra etzel hidyot b'korban tzibur, right? But so tuma is not permitted for a kohen gadol for an individual offering, but it is permitted for a regular kohen, right? I should say, not permitted even for a kohen gadol in an individual offering, but it is permitted for a regular kohen in a public offering. So aninut shehutra michala etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid. So an onen status, right? Someone who's in that status, which is permitted for a kohen gadol even in an individual offering. Ein odin shehutra etzel kohen gadol b'korban tzibur. Wouldn't it then be permitted for a regular kohen in a korban tzibur? Okay, you follow the logic. Okay, it's just va-chomer logic. If tuma is hutra b'tzibur basically for even a regular kohen, then all the more so aninut, which is already permitted to the kohen gadol in regular, even in individual offerings, shouldn't you permit it to a regular kohen in a korban tzibur? Matkif Rava bar Ahilai. Now, Rava bar Ahilai starts to attack him from a whole bunch of directions. Okay, we're going to just, before we go through this, before we see what he says, we're going to go through three assumptions in the words of Rava. Okay, assumption number one, tuma is not permitted to a kohen gadol in a korban yachid, right? In an individual's offering, right? Tuma doesn't. Kohen gadol who's impure can't do anything. That's number one. Number two, tuma is hutra b'tzibur. When tuma is hutra, it's hutra to any kohen, right? Any kohen can do tuma hutra b'tzibur, right? That once the majority of the people or the majority of the kohenim, any kohen can come in even impure, right, and do it. Three, aninut is permitted to the kohen gadol even in an individual offering. Okay, those are three basic assumptions which are obvious. Okay, obvious, they're true halakhic. What Rava bar Ahilai is going to do now is say, if you can make that va-chomer, I'll make three va-chomers that knock out those three assumptions that we just said. Okay, so we're going to start with the last one. Number one, lo tutar aninut etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid va-chomer. Maybe we shouldn't allow a kohen gadol to be involved in an individual sacrifice from a va-chomer from tuma. Ma tuma shu tried kohen idiot b'tzibur, lo hu tried kohen idiot b'korban yachid. If tuma is permitted to the tzibur for a regular kohen to do it, and yet it's not permitted, right? If a kohen gadol wants to do a korban when he's tameh for an individual person, no way, no how can he do it. So you see how much stricter we are, right? In that case. So aninut shelo hu tried kohen idiot b'korban tzibur. So aninut, which no kohen can ever do, even a communal offering, never allowed, a regular kohen. Einod, so it's more strict. Aninut, einodin shelo tutar etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid. So maybe a kohen gadol can't do a work of an individual's korban even when he's an onen, because onen has this way that it's more severe than tuma. Okay, so that's number one. It's obviously not true, and that's why I'm saying this is ridiculous to say your va-chomer, because you could also say a va-chomer like this. Next one. V'tutar, this was the first assumption I said. Tutar tum'a etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid va-chomer. Maybe we should allow a kohen gadol to do a korban yachid even when he's impure, an individual's offering. Why? Aninut shelo tried kohen idiot b'korban tzibur, right? Aninut is more severe because no kohen is a regular kohen is never allowed to do it even for a public offering, and yet hutra etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid, and yet we're going to permit aninut though for a kohen gadol even in an individual offering. So tuma, all the more so tuma, which is already hutra etzel kohen idiot b'korban tzibur, a regular kohen can do it in a communal offering. Why don't we then say einodin hutra etzel kohen gadol b'korban yachid? So shouldn't we even allow tuma? We should basically allow tuma the way aninut is allowed for kohen gadol, right? Even in a korban yachid, which is obviously ridiculous. And third, lo tutar tuma etzel kohen idiot b'korban tzibur mikal va-chomer. We shouldn't permit tuma by a regular kohen in a public offering from a va-chomer. Okay, in other words, a regular kohen, there's too much to it. Tzibur shouldn't be based on va-chomer. Uma'aninu. By the way, if your Hebrew's good, in Sugya B'Ktana this week, it's all about Tumah Tzibur and this whole concept. Uma'aninu hu tra etza kohen gadol b'korban yachid lo hu tra etza kohen idiot b'korban tzibur. Aninut, which is not permitted to a kohen gadol in a korban, is permitted to a kohen gadol, an individual. And yet, lo hu tra etza kohen idiot b'korban tzibur, and yet it's not permitted to a regular kohen in a public offering. Tuma shalohu tra etza korban gadol b'korban yachid. So now tuma is much more severe because it's not permitted to a kohen gadol the way aninut is permitted, right? In an individual offering. Ein odin shalo tutar b'kohen idiot b'korban tzibur. So we shouldn't allow tuma tra b'tzibur to the tzibur because tuma is obviously more strict than aninut, and aninut isn't allowed for the public, right? For a regular kohen in a public offering. So basically, he says, and I'll just continue to the next two lines in the next daf. So we finish the sugya. You can take this va-chomer and ask that question, and whatever. Just stick with each law and its place, and don't try to make va-chomers and try to compare them and try to come up with these conclusions. So he basically rejects what. Okay, let's try to remember. Rava said onen pasul is only, he wanted to limit it only to an individual offering, but a public offering going to be allowed, va-chomer from tuma, which is allowed va-tzibur. But basically, Rava bar Ahilai says, ridiculous va-chomer, you can get to ridiculous conclusions, and I won't accept that. Which, by the way, raises the questions about our previous va-chomers, right? Theoretically, you could start asking questions on them too. But anyway, we're going to stop here for today, and that was our daf. 3 proofs for the zar, why it's disqualified, 3 proofs for the onen, why it's disqualified, possible limitation, suggestion that the disqualification of onen is limited only to individual offerings, but rejected. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and perhaps mamash b'karov.